Hello and welcome to Breakdown. My name is Chris Morris, and each week I break down the corporate fascist state in which we live and some of the consequences of it. Just going to begin today's programme as usual by reminding you to visit the website flippingthepyramid.co.uk, in which you can listen to my previous programmes and the previous programmes of the other hosts on the station and see a whole lot of other information. And you can also listen to this programme again in the future by going to my YouTube channel, which you can locate on YouTube by just typing in Breakdown Radio Show, which is all one word. We're going to discuss today some issues related to the fiscal cliff. We've recently seen in the United States the so-called fiscal cliff crisis. The fiscal cliff referring to a series of punitive tax measures that would come into place had the United States gone over the fiscal cliff. All this rather rhetorical political language is really to hide the fact that it was merely another example of the United States going over its borrowing limits. So its borrowing limits were being raised because it was trillions and trillions of dollars in debt, and is running a budget deficit of over $1 trillion as well. So although governments can continue borrowing and printing money, they can't do this indefinitely. So sooner or later they actually have to service the debt. If you had a mainstream economist on here now, they would argue that you can't really compare it directly to household finances because governments and countries have all these options related to debt that households don't, which is true. What they don't mention is all these options devalue the currency and make all the people of modest means in the society steadily poorer, and this is what's happened with both the dollar and sterling, particularly since they came off the gold standard. So, I fundamentally disagree with all the proposals that were put forward, both the fiscal cliff, which was avoided. There was this completely phony political theatre that took place in which all the Republicans are going to block what Obama wants to do. Or we've had a bit of a discussion, we've watered it down, and surprisingly the bill's gone through, like it always does when there's something that needs to go through that benefits the establishment. The Patriot Act comes to mind, but there are many other examples. Very rare you actually get the Congress or the Senate blocking these establishment bills. They actually did block the cap and trade legislation very marginally, as far as I don't know if that's been put up to go in front of the Congress since. As far as I know, it hasn't. But that's something I'll talk about in a future program. But that example is the exception, not the rule. Of course, most of the time, this supposedly brilliant system of checks and balances achieves nothing except a political theatre that all the mainstream press, particularly in the United States, particularly the commercial press in the United States and the broadcast media, but very much the case in Britain as well. You certainly get the BBC implying that some bitter political dispute was taking place, when ultimately the senators and the congressmen completely folded because it is presented to them in terms that they understand, which is this will be in your interest, and so they all just fold very, very quickly. In actual fact, it's not really in their long-term interest at all, but I would assume that most of them are too narrow-minded and too focused on the details of their everyday existence to see the bigger picture. And of course there are lots of them that are corrupt, and even if they do see the bigger picture they just don't care. But anyway, the fiscal cliff crisis was averted because Obama came up with some plan which basically involves more taxation and more debt, and there's no real plan to change the economic paradigm in any significant way. Now, when you're critical of this type of thing, people tend to come back to you and say, oh, well, what would you do then? What would you do differently? It's easy to sit there and criticise what could be done differently. So what I'm going to discuss this week and next week will be the first part this week, and the second part will be next week, is a 50-point plan to radically change the socio and economic situation of the United States for the better. And these are things that I would put forward. I'm going to begin today by discussing foreign policy firstly, and then in the second half of the programme I'll be discussing economic policy. I'm going to go on next week to discuss some domestic issues and political appointments. But I'm just really programme's going to be just going through the points and providing the evidence to support those points. So it's quite a straightforward programme. So I'll just begin at the top of the list with point 1. Point one is stop funding Islamic militants in Syria as a pretext to invade the country. This is particularly important at the moment with we're now seeing France going into Africa, supposedly to fight Islamic militants, with now David Cameron coming on television the other day and saying that this war in Africa against militant Islam could last decades. You know, and I can, the way things are going, I can fully see that I'm going to be 80 years old sitting there watching the TV and it'll be 2050 or something, and there'll be whoever's prime minister by that time will probably still be part of the Bullingdon Club. Will probably still have gone to Eton. Probably still have gone to the Oxford and Cambridge debating clubs. He'll be sitting there going, "Yeah, we're going to win the war on terror soon if we just keep fighting." I'm pretty sure Al Qaeda will still be mentioned in the news when I'm on my deathbed. It'll still be there as this bogeyman, as similar to I think, if I remember right, the name's Goldstein in the book 1984, which is what Al Qaeda is, because it doesn't exist as a coordinated network. Any attempts to prove that there's some sort of international coordinated Al Qaeda network have proven to be completely fraudulent and completely fallacious. But just to briefly show that both Britain and the United States have been funding the Al Qaeda in Syria, there's I've discussed this in depth on my programme on Syria. There's just a Wall Street Journal article here. Clinton pledges $45 million to Syrian opposition. New York State Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said the US would give more aid to Syrian opposition groups and reiterated Washington's demands that, as the bodies keep piling up in morgues, the Syrian regime must end. Blah, blah, blah. And there's an article from the BBC, 10th of August 2012, UK to give extra £5 million to opposition groups. And they've recently been discussing openly arming these groups as well. And it's been completely conceded by Clinton as well that these so-called rebel groups can contain Al-Qaeda. I mean, I wouldn't even use the term Al-Qaeda. I would really just describe them as militant Islamic groups or militant Islamic forces. I mean, to suggest Al-Qaeda suggests that they're part of some coordinated network like Google or something, which simply doesn't exist, because what happens is that you get individual people, individual militants, and small splinter groups of militants. There are definitely Islamic militant groups in the world, and there are definitely Islamic people that commit atrocities. But they just call themselves Al Qaeda. They'll use the Al Qaeda flag and say, "Oh yeah, we're doing this for Al Qaeda," and it implies, and because of all the mythology that's been built up around them by our political leaders, we then think, well, we don't think. Hopefully, I don't think. But the general public tends to think, oh, Al-Qaeda are this huge, incredible organisation. They've got their tentacles going out all over the world, which really has nothing to do with the reality on the ground. And even people that broadly support the war on terror, and even books that sort of promote or put forward the generally accepted view of Al-Qaeda that the establishment wants to put forward, which is rubbish, incidentally. But, let's just assume for the sake of argument that it isn't rubbish. Even those views have to acknowledge that it's not an internationalist terrorist network with lots of scope to communicate across borders. It's simply nothing like that exists. So I wouldn't even use the term Al-Qaeda, but in my program on Syria you can see Hillary Clinton admitting that Al-Qaeda are involved in the Syrian opposition groups. So the second point number 2, would be guarantee that Iran will not be subject to military action. So if you go back even as far as September 2009, although there have been plenty of statements since then in relation to that. But there's an article here, Obama, Iran is on notice, won't rule out military action. This is September 25th, 2009. So I could read more from that article, but I'm sure you're all well aware of what's going on in Iran. If not, I've made a program about that, which discusses the issue and the history of Iran in some depth. There's also a program by Keelan which discusses the nuclear weapons of Iran, or not, as the case may be, because the concept they've got a nuclear program to produce nuclear weapons is completely fatuous. So point number 3. Concede that it's totally hypocritical for the US to be dictating to Iran regarding nuclear weapons when the United States possess thousands and the only country in history to have utilised atomic weaponry. Of course, that was at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So if you look at the history, just very briefly from Wikipedia, nuclear weapons in the United States. The peak stockpile of nuclear weapons the United States had during the so-called Cold War was over 30,000. It's claimed here that they have over 5,000 nuclear weapons currently, but I've seen some estimates as high as 10,000. But I mean, Iran signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which allows them to create nuclear energy, and it's been acknowledged by the US that they're allowed to create nuclear energy, and it's been acknowledged by the US they don't have a nuclear weapon and they're not trying to create nuclear weapons. So constantly dictating to them regarding and implying they're about to build a nuclear bomb is ridiculous. It's particularly ridiculous given the context of what we just discussed, which is that the US have thousands of nuclear weapons. Even the lowest estimates, even the most conservative estimates, say thousands. So that's the situation. The fourth point would be to acknowledge the US role in creating the conditions that exist in Iran by meddling in their foreign policy towards the country, particularly beginning with Operation Ajax in 1953. This is extensively discussed in my programme on Iran. But it was also mentioned in some of the context of what's going on in Iran was discussed by Ron Paul during his election campaign. I'm going to play a clip now, particularly related to sanctions that were proposed and are currently being carried out against Iran. So I'll just go to that clip.
I yield 2.5 minutes to an American patriot, someone who's been relentless in his efforts to stop America from blundering into foreign adventures. Congressman Ron Paul from Texas.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I think this bill would be better named if we called it Obsession with Iran Act 2012. Because this is what we continue to be doing, is obsessed with Iran and the idea that Iran is a threat to our national security. Iran happens to be a third world nation. They have no significant Navy, Air Force, intercontinental ballistic missiles. The IAEA and our CIA said they're not on the verge of a nuclear weapon. It's so similar to what we went through in the early part of this last decade when we were beating the war drums to go to war against Iraq. And it was all a facade. There was no danger from Iraq. So this is what we're doing, beating the war drums once again. Now, since the bill has come back from the conference, we're going to deal with civil liberties in Syria. Well, I happen to be a civil libertarian. I'm very concerned about civil liberties. But let me tell you, this bill is not going to do anything to enhance the civil liberties of the individuals in Syria. Now, if we were really interested in civil liberties, why wouldn't we look to ourselves? Why wouldn't we look to the things that we do here? What about our warrantless searches under the Patriot Act? What about the policy of assassination and assassinating American citizens? What about arrest by the military, National Defense Authorization Act? What about the drone warfare that we go on? Do you think we're protecting civil liberties by arbitrarily dropping drones or threatening to drop drones any place in the world with innocent people dying? If we want to really care about civil liberties in Syria, why don't we care about the secret prisons we have and the history of torture that we've had in this country? What about the fact that kill lists are being made by the executive branch of government and we sit idly by and approve of it by saying nothing, and the American people put up with it, and we march in this direction, marching into a determination to have another war? When you put on sanctions on a country, it's an act of war, and that's what this is all about. The first thing you do when war breaks out between two countries is you put sanctions on them. You blockade the country. So this is an act of war. What would we do if somebody blockaded and put sanctions on us and prevented the importation of any product in this country? We'd be furious, we'd declare war, we'd go to war. So we are the antagonists. We're over there poking our nose in other people's affair, just looking for the chance to start another war. First it's Syria, then Iran. We have too many wars. We need to stop the wars. We don't have the money to fight these wars any longer. Gentlemen, for yielding. I'm still rather impressed with the obsession over a weapon that does not exist, and no concern whatsoever about many nuclear weapons that are held by countries that never even joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is called for in the debate that Iran should end all its nuclear programs. But they're permitted to have their nuclear programs under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the other countries that have weapons, and including the countries that hold the weapons that came from the Soviet system, seems like that would be a much greater danger. You know, the investigation by the UN or by our CAs never indicated that they've ever enriched above 20%. And they said they won't even do it to 20% if they would merely allow it. The West would cooperate and sell them this material. They said, we don't need it, but we need 20% enrichment for nuclear isotopes, medical isotopes. So our refusal to deal with them prompts them to take it up enrichment to 20%. 5%, of course, is what they're allowed to do for nuclear energies. But this idea that we can badger people and then defy the law, what we're asking them to do is to close down their program is you're asking them to defy international law. They agreed to this. They have a right to do this under this treaty. And for us to come and say, well, they must quit it, I think it really is very close to an obsession on a country that is incapable of attacking us or attacking. They don't have a history of invading their neighboring countries. The last time they were at war was with Iraq, and we bugged Iraq to go into Iran. So I find this very distressing that the obsession continues. I find it very, very upsetting that this vote will, of course, be overwhelmingly in support of correcting the civil liberties of Syria and making Iran toe the line and give up on something that they're permitted to do. A vote for this, in my opinion, in time will show that it's just one more step to another war that we don't need. We have not been provoked. They are not a threat to our national security. And we should not be doing this. We've been doing it too long. For the last 10, 15 years, we're just obsessed with this idea that we go to war and try to solve all the problems of the world. At the same time, it is bankrupting us. I strongly urge a no vote on this resolution.
Okay, point 5 is simply to withdraw all US troops immediately from all overseas conflicts. Again, to mention Ron Paul, this was something he specifically proposed during his presidential campaign, as was point 6, which is close down all overseas US military bases. As I've mentioned several times, US has military bases in 135 nations. One of the arguments that's often put forward against this type of thing is that it costs jobs. There's a clip that I'm going to play in a second, which is related to investigation that took place in Britain by Will Self, who's a writer and occasional journalist, in which he looked into the British arms industry, and then someone put forward an incredibly crass argument as to why this could never be addressed. But it's often argued that this would cost jobs, but there are in fact many ways to reorganise the economy completely. I mean, Will Self in this particular clip suggests a very small scale way of doing it, but it can be done on a massive scale. You completely change the nature of the way the economy works. At the moment, there are huge influences that completely distort the way the economy works, and these can easily be held to account. These can be easily changed if there's the political will to do so. I haven't seen any evidence there is the political will to do so, but I'll just briefly look at a couple of articles here. Foreign Policy in Focus. I'll just explain briefly who they are. It's a project of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. They describe themselves as a think tank without walls and bring together over 600 writers, scholars, academics, artists and activists seeking to make the United States a more responsible global partner. So they've got an article here that just states, it's headlined, "Bring War Dollars Home by Closing Down Bases." And they present a lot of arguments for doing what I've just suggested, essentially, and talk about the vast American military budget and the vast American budget deficit. So I'll just briefly play the clip that I mentioned, which deals with the arms industry in Britain.
Give them money, but are they grateful? No, they're spiteful and they're hateful.
Everybody gets bananas about the arms trade, I mean, there's very little in the real arms trade. Something that goes bang, or is a weapon, an offensive weapon of war, are very, very few. The great bulk of the sales that we have are in things that are much more humanitarian based rather than nasty, evil, vicious killing weapons.
Don't respect us, so let's surprise them. We'll drop the big one, pulverize.
I mean, that really is a pretty silly argument if you think about it, because you could apply that criteria to absolutely anything. You could say stop making cars, and after a while people will find other jobs to do. I mean, it just isn't true. And if you...
Excuse me, why isn't it true? I mean, if I stop you, Major General Alan Shum, being head of the Defence Manufacturers Association, will you get another job?
Don't know. Probably.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Now hold on.
But
Amir Ani, you're a producer director for BBC Correspondent. If I stop you doing that job, will you go and get another one?
Yeah, of course. Yes.
David, you're a camera and sound man on this film. Would you go and do something else?
You'd have to.
You'd have to. You'd have to.
But where would those people go and work? That would require an increase in some other commercial activity.
That's what's been happens all the time in economies, isn't it? Yes.
It does and it doesn't. Well, yes, it's okay to that extent. That's true.
It's just a model of what we...
Oh, that's a model?
Yes.
That's not a real gun?
No.
Oh, okay, thank you. Have you ever been asked to camouflage an entire country? You just cover the whole country with camouflage, so that you can't see it.
I haven't been that lucky.
Okay, point 7 is to slash the US defence budget to almost zero, simply retaining enough expenditure to maintain a modicum of home defence. This will never actually be needed, as no country will ever attack the US mainland, because they've got thousands of nuclear weapons. It never gets attacked by a sovereign nation. No, even the most hawkish defendee of US foreign policy can never claim that a sovereign nation has attacked the US mainland, because it's never happened, and they know very well that it never will happen, unless they're completely delusional. This would eradicate the American budget deficit almost overnight. So I previously stated that America has a $1 trillion defence budget. I've actually slightly underestimated that, because the total spending in the budget breakdown for 2012 was estimated to be between $1.03 and $1.4 trillion. This is before you go into the black budgets that trillions of dollars are poured into, that I will be discussing in one of the later points. If you go to the authoritative USDebtClock.org, you'll see that the current federal budget deficit is just over $1 trillion, $1,063 billion. So the US defence budget actually exceeds the budget deficit. So if you could cut the US budget, US defence budget by over $1 trillion, which I believe is perfectly achievable if we go through all the economic measures that I'm going to be discussing, then you'd wipe out the budget deficit overnight. So this would be arguably the most valuable thing on the list that you could do. Of course, it hasn't really been proposed yet. Point 8 is to close down Guantanomo Bay, which was promised by Obama during the election campaign. I'll now just play a clip regarding this.
There are a number of different things that you could do early pertaining to executive orders.
Right.
One of them is to shut down Guantanamo Bay. Mm-hmm. Another is to change interrogation methods that are used by U.S. troops. Are those things that you plan to take early action on?
Yes. I have said repeatedly that I intend to close Guantanamo, and I will follow through on that. I've said repeatedly that America doesn't torture, and I'm going to make sure that we don't torture. Those are part and parcel of an effort to regain America's moral stature in the world.
In addition to Guantanamo Bay, there are also some other less high-profile prison camps that very much resemble Guantanamo Bay. So point 9 is simply to close down these camps as well. Point 10 is to end the policy of extraordinary rendition, which was promised during the election campaign, and to make this policy completely transparent. So we've got an article here from the Daily Telegraph from 2009, simply headlined "Barack Obama to allow anti-terror rendition to continue." The highly controversial anti-terror practice of rendition will continue under Barack Obama, it has emerged. Despite ordering the closure of Guantanomo, which he failed to do, and an end to harsh interrogation techniques, the new president has failed to call an end to secret abductions and questioning, which is what extraordinary rendition actually is. In fact, if you go back and look at what Obama did, he actually just changed the name of the policy related to extraordinary renditions, so they don't call them extraordinary renditions anymore. They give them a slightly different name. But it just says here, according to a detailed reading of the executive orders signed by Obama on the 22nd of January, renditions have not been outlawed, with the new administration deciding it needs to retain some devices in Mr. Bush's anti-terror arsenal amid continued threats to US national security. So if you go to the PolitiFact website as well, they document the fact that rendition has not been renounced. And the preservation of renditions as a quote-unquote counter-terrorism tool was reported in the US press as well. There's an article here in February 2009 in the Los Angeles Times, also starting by saying the CIA's secret prisons are being shuttered, except that it never happened. But even they are acknowledging here that rendition is going to be preserved and is still something that Obama may use if he wishes to do so. Point 11 is to apologise explicitly and publicly for the US policy of bombing Vietnam with Agent Orange and make immediate plans to pay the Vietnamese the compensation that they have never received. This was discussed explicitly in my 5th programme that I made, which was about the history of US foreign policy, or post-Second World War US foreign policy, and Britain as well. So there's more about Agent Orange there, but it was a pretty disgusting, destructive policy that's caused immense suffering in Vietnam, and they've never apologised for it publicly, even when they knew the level of suffering that they were causing. Point number 12 would be to end US military aid to Israel, publicly acknowledge that Israel is occupying Palestine, state that a peaceful two-state resolution would be the best outcome, but that the United States will no longer intervene directly. So, just to briefly go over some of these points, there's an article here from July 2012 on Politico. It's headlined, Obama's aid increased to Israel. President Barack Obama said on Friday that he's releasing an additional $70 million in military aid for Israel, a previously announced move that appeared timed to upstage Republican rival Mitt Romney's trip to Israel this weekend. So they're falling over each other, trying to appeal to Israel more than they are already. So there's an authoritative discussion here in the Jewish Virtual Library of all the military aid that's been paid to the United States, but it's over $100 billion since 1974, and it breaks that down into great detail, showing how that's occurred. But the military aid to Israel is goes up year after year after year, and it's over $3 billion per year now. It's actually increased quite significantly under the Obama presidency. It's increased by approximately 25% just in the last 3 to 4 years. And bear in mind they'd already received over $100 billion in aid by 2009, but yet military aid is still being increased every year. It creeps up 5-6% every year, but it's increased by 20% in the period 2009 to 2013. So that will be, again, this is something that I will definitely do a programme about in the future. It's just spectacularly misunderstood by most people in Britain. I assume it's spectacularly misunderstood by most people in America. So I'll be doing a programme about the Israel-Palestine conflict at some point in the future. Point number 13 is to end US arms sales all over the world, particularly focusing on not selling arms and having favourable trading relationships with countries with abysmal human rights records, such as Saudi Arabia. So you can go on to Wikipedia and see the Saudi Arabia-United States relations, which are essentially very, very warm. But there's a fairly famous book published in 2004 called House of Bush, House of Saud, which has got a picture of one of the members of the House of Saud, which is the Saudi Arabian royal family essentially, holding hands with George Bush on a trip to Saudi Arabia. So just to briefly read from Wikipedia, House of Bush, House of Saud, The Secret Relationship Between the World's Two Most Powerful Dynasties is a 2004 book by Craig Unger that explores the relationship between the Saudi royal family and the Bush extended political family. Unger asserts that the groundwork for today's terrorist movements and the modern wars that have sprung up about them was unintentionally laid more than 30 years ago with a series of business deals between the ruling Saudis and the powerful Bush family. The Saudis received investments and military protection in exchange for cooperation on lucrative oil deals. The author claims that the result has been a shady alliance between the world's two most powerful dynasties. Unger writes, "Never before has an American president been so closely tied to a foreign power that harbours and supports our country's mortal enemies." So in relation to that particular last comment, it's just worth pointing out briefly that Bush blocked an investigation into hijackers that were named by the official 9/11 investigation as being from Saudi Arabia, completely blocked any investigation into those people because it might have shown up that there were links between them and Saudi Arabia. And then at that point, the US relationship with Saudi Arabia will become even more hypocritical than it is already. Of course, it's already massively hypocritical, even if you don't take that into consideration, because they're constantly going around saying, "Oh, Islamic terrorism is terrible," but then they and using that as a justification for their foreign policy. Of course, their foreign policy isn't really driven by ideology. It's driven by greed, it's driven by power, it's driven by vested interests, it's driven by banking, military, industrial interests. But for them to claim that they're out there due to the desire to wipe Al-Qaeda off the face of the earth, when they have this incredibly favourable relationship with Saudi Arabia, who've been shown time and time again to be a source of Islamic militancy and Islamic extremism, and are even some of the hijackers that are aimed in their own official 9/11 narrative clearly hail from Saudi Arabia, it would obviously look completely ridiculous, especially as they justified the justified response to 9/11 was to obviously go and bomb Afghanistan. I mean, on the face of it, it would be no more unreasonable to bomb Saudi Arabia, but obviously they're not going to do that because they have this favourable oil relationship with the country. Point number 14 is to end all drone bombing. Explicitly state that no further drone bombing will take place ever again. Publicly acknowledge the authoritative studies that have taken place which indicate that the policy kills 10 civilians per militant that it targets. Apologise publicly for all the civilians that have been slaughtered by US drone bombing in Pakistan, Somalia, Libya, the Yemen, etc. And they're now expanding that policy out into Mali and Algeria, and there are other examples that I've mentioned there. So I discussed this in one of my previous programmes quite explicitly, but it's just a brief article here from October 2012. CIA chiefs face arrest over horrific evidence of bloody video game sorties by drone pilots. So this is a good article by the Mail on Sunday. I don't think anyone, including myself, involved in this programme in any way is likely to be a fan of the Daily Mail. I'm certainly not a fan of the Daily Mail, but I will say this in their defence. They do occasionally print some good articles that other press don't. And this is a good article by them talking about the US drone attacks in Pakistan. The Mail on Sunday today reveals shocking new evidence of the full horrific impact of US drone attacks in Pakistan. A damning dossier assembled from exhaustive research into the strike's targets sets out in heartbreaking detail the deaths of teachers, students and Pakistani policemen. It also describes how bereaved relatives are forced to gather their loved ones' dismembered body parts in the aftermath of strikes. The dossier has been assembled by human rights lawyer Shahzad Akbar, who works for Pakistan's Foundation for Fundamental Rights and the British human rights charity Reprieve. Filed in two separate court cases, it is set to trigger a formal murder investigation by police into the roles of two US officials said to have ordered the strikes. They are Jonathan Banks, former head of the Central Intelligence Agency's Islamabad station, and John A. Rizzo, the CIA's former chief lawyer. Mr. Akbar and his staff have already gathered further testimony which has yet to be filed. Quote, "We have statements from a further 82 victims' families relating to more than 30 drone strikes," he said. "This is their only hope of justice." So this article goes on, and what's important to note is whenever drone bombing is talked about, and it's talked about very, very rarely on the political stage, it's only been mentioned occasionally. It's almost been mentioned as much in Obama's pathetic and completely tasteless joke as it actually has in any sort of legitimate discussion in why it's taking place. But when the CIA and when the US military justify drone bombing, they tend to say it's to target militants. But in actual fact, as I've already mentioned, there's an authoritative study that's taken place which indicates the policy kills 10 civilians per militant. And in addition to that, you can see from this particular court case the extent to which it's just destroying the lives of ordinary people in Pakistan. They've not done anything to hurt anyone. You know, I think there's a lot of people still in Britain and still in America that thinks everyone that lives in Pakistan is on the verge of blowing themselves up to avenge some perceived slight against the Middle East, which wouldn't in itself be unreasonable, seeing as this is a fundamental part of the blowback theories. It's often described that even people that don't challenge the official version of 9/11 will place it in a blowback context. Noam Chomsky is the most obvious example, where they say that it's completely understandable given the decades of US foreign policy and NATO foreign policy and very much British supported foreign policy towards the region. However, most people in Pakistan are not militant Islamists who are about to blow themselves up for the benefit of Allah and the benefit of Muhammad. They're just ordinary people leading quiet lives in a fairly poverty-stricken country that don't really deserve to have these unmanned drones dropping incredibly destructive weaponry on their heads and killing all of their families. Point number 15 is to end the activities of the Central Intelligence Agency outside of the borders of the United States. Its funding should be radically cut, and this chain of command should be restored to ensure that it's directly responsible to the President, who is directly responsible to the Congress. It should be ensured that the CIA only deals with matters within the borders of the United States. So if we go back to an article from 2002, which is the former German Defence Minister Andre van Bülow being interviewed by the newspaper Tagesspiegel in Germany. This is actually the 13th of January 2002. He has some interesting things to say about the Central Intelligence Agency. So it's just important to note, firstly, that this guy has a very direct involvement with these things and obviously has inside information that most of us don't get access to. I'll just briefly discuss what he has to say about the CIA and about intelligence agencies in general. It is right to take a look behind the scenes. Getting intelligence about the intentions of an enemy makes sense. It is important when one tries to put oneself in the mind of the enemy. Whoever wants to understand the CIA's methods has to deal with its main tasks, which are covert operations, below the level of war and outside international law. Foreign states are to be influenced by organising insurrections, terrorist attacks, usually combined with drugs and weapons trade and money laundering. This is essentially very simple. One arms violent people with weapons. Since, however, it must not under any circumstances come out that there is an intelligence agency behind it, all traces are erased with tremendous deployment of resources. I have the impression that this kind of intelligence agency spends 90% of its time this way, simply creating false leads, so that if anyone suspects the collaboration of the agencies, he is accused of the sickness of conspiracy madness. The truth often comes out only years later. CIA Chief Alan Dulles once said, "In the case of doubt, I would even lie to the Congress." So it's important to just briefly point out that von Bülow obviously has an intimate inside knowledge of those things. And secondly, I've dealt previously in my 5th and 6th programmes with some of the known action of intelligence agencies throwing out democratic governments all over the world. So we can only guess what they've got up to that we don't know about. But this directly relates to point 16, which would be to order a huge independent investigation into 9/11, fund it properly, and ensure that the people who sit on the Commission can't be accused of massive vested interest. Finally, it must be ensured that no hypothesis is automatically ruled out before the Commission begins looking at the evidence. So to deal with those points one by one, the investigation was blocked for over a year, while FEMA essentially destroyed as much evidence as they possibly could, and as much evidence was suppressed, covered up, and destroyed as was humanly possible. Secondly, and this was all justified by saying that it would distract us from the fight on terror. The war on terror, we can't put any resources into investigating what happened because it would distract us from the war on terror. This was literally what was put forward for a year until they finally agreed to have an investigation, and then they failed to fund it properly, and then they asked Kissinger to head the commission. Obviously, Kissinger can't possibly be considered to be neutral, leaving aside the fact that he's considered a war criminal in large parts of the world. Even the New York Times was greatly critical of the commission for appointing Kissinger. And eventually Kissinger had to step down due to the fact they had obvious vested interests. But then they put two people called Kian and Zelikow in charge of the 9/11 Commission, and these two people had obvious links to the Bush administration as well. This leaving aside the fact that the Commission never looked at large parts of the evidence that needed to be looked at, and it had a very narrow remit that essentially prevented them from turning up anything that was incriminating. In addition to that, Bush and Cheney were interviewed in private, so we don't know anything about what they had to say whatsoever. And then in addition to that, there's the fact that Bush refused to reveal the Saudi 9/11 information, so the CBS News discussing that here. President Bush refused on Tuesday to release a congressional report alleging possible links between Saudi Arabian officials and the September 11th hijackers. The White House sought to question a Saudi citizen who befriended two of the hijackers. Bush said he could not comply with a request by the Saudi foreign minister for a chance to clear the Arab kingdom's name because publication of the report could hurt US intelligence operations. So that's how committed they were to getting to the bottom of what had actually occurred. Then you have the David Ray Griffin article here that I could read the whole of, but it's just titled The 9/11 Commission Report, a 571-page lie. He previously described the report as a 571-page avoidance of any serious discussion of what actually happened, and pointed out that most of it is simply about what the response should be in terms of restructuring the American economy, which is of course exactly what's happened, which is in a sense what I'm responding to here today. So, by now the chance of actually getting to the bottom of what happened on 9/11 would be extremely remote, in my opinion, but it's simply owed to the American, considering the extent to which US foreign policy and US domestic policy has been influenced by 9/11, is absolutely owed to the American people for there to be a proper independent investigation set up that actually looks into what happened with an open mind. So that would be something that I consider to be essential. Point 17 is the last foreign policy related issue, and it would simply be to divert some of the trillions of dollars of black budgets that are currently poured into clandestine Pentagon programs into firstly eliminating the budget deficit, and secondly reducing some of the US external and government debt, and thirdly to fund existing and new social programs that would be created. So I can briefly go over this because this isn't a contentious issue, it's something that is well known about. Again, Ron Paul nobly mentioned this during his election campaign. And there's an article here from The Examiner in January 2012. This headline, Ron Paul planned to restore America challenges secret $1 trillion black budget. So he's talking here about the Pentagon's black budget and the trillions of dollars that are poured into it. This is pretty openly known about and pretty openly discussed, although of course we don't hear about it on the BBC, or you won't hear about it on Fox or CNN or CBS News generally. But even to pick the last of those examples, even CBS News reported on something that happened on the September the 10th, 2011, which was that Donald Rumsfeld stated that $2.3 trillion of Pentagon expenditure couldn't be accounted for. So I'll just briefly play a clip related to that, which is the CBS News report on the subject.
Pentagon, the day before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared war, not on foreign terrorists.
The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy.
He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat.
In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death.
Rumsfeld promised change, but the next day, the world changed. And in the rush to fund the war on terrorism, the war on waste seems to have been forgotten.
My 03 budget calls for more than $48 billion in new defense spending.
More money for the Pentagon when its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. To understand how the Pentagon can lose track of trillions, consider the case of one military accountant who tried to find out what happened to a mere $300 million.
We know it's gone, but we don't know what they spent it on.
Jim Minery, a former Marine turned whistleblower, is risking his job by speaking out for the first time about the millions he noticed were missing from one defense agency's balance sheets. Minery tried to follow the money trail, even crisscrossing the country looking for records.
The director looked at me and he says, "Why do you care about this stuff?" It took me aback, you know. My supervisor asked me why I care about doing a good job. So.
He was reassigned and says officials then covered up the problem by just writing it off.
They got to cover it up. That's where the corruption comes in. They've got to cover up the fact that they can't do the job.
The Pentagon's Inspector General partially substantiated several of Minnery's allegations, but could not prove officials tried to manipulate the financial statements. 20 years ago, Pentagon employee Franklin C. Spinney made headlines exposing what he calls the accounting games. He's still there, and although he does not speak for the Pentagon, he believes the problem has gotten worse.
Those numbers are pie in the sky. The books are cooked routinely year after year after year.
Retired Vice Admiral Jack Shanahan commanded the Navy's Second Fleet the first time Donald Rumsfeld served as Defense Secretary.
With good financial oversight, we could find $48 billion in loose change in that building without having to hit the taxpayers.
In the 2.5 minutes since this report began, the Pentagon has spent nearly $2 million, and it may never know where 25% of those tax dollars went. In Los Angeles, I'm Vince Gonzalez for Eye on America.
Now, some rather lofty claims have been made about this regarding why this $2.3 trillion was covered up and what's happened to it. But, I mean, it simply gives an indication of black budgets relate to the military and the extent to which the Pentagon black budget swallows up taxpayers' funds. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, really, if you read some of the stuff that's been alleged by the extent of these secret programs. And, of course, it's the Pentagon that's produced so many things that are used in everyday life that are then sold back to the public they're then handed to the corporate and private sector to sell back to the public. The internet is the most well-known example. There are many other examples, including GPS positioning system that is used in that people have got in the satellite navigation systems in their cars. But all these $1 trillion of Pentagon black budgets are helping to bankrupt the country. So if they could be ended immediately, then you'd have trillions of dollars that could be put into social programs. This is what I mean by the extent to which massive factors distort the economy and the extent to which it could be changed fundamentally by it being reordered. And then this really it doesn't take anything particularly radical. It doesn't take an economic genius. It doesn't take someone that's got a master's degree from Harvard Business School or London School of Economics. It just takes someone who's willing to stand up and be honest about what's really happening and stop some of these clandestine and completely unnecessary programs. So you get people that are hostile to the idea that 9/11 was an inside job, trying to state that this $2.3 trillion is a red herring, when in fact it's completely admitted that it is the case that $2.3 trillion couldn't be accounted for. And it's also completely admitted to be the case that there are trillions of dollars being poured into these Pentagon black budgets, which is how all this stuff is created. Because most of the all of the $1.4 trillion that I mentioned earlier can be broken down and accounted for in various areas that simply related to the foreign policy that we hear about on a daily basis, that is promoted by Obama, promoted by Cameron, promoted by various elements within NATO and the United Nations. This is just the overt, put military bases in every country on the earth virtually, going to countries, intervening militarily, drone bomb as many nations as you possibly can, develop new technology in order to do this. That is and then homeland defence as well. That is pretty much what the Pentagon, what the mainstream, you might describe it as, overt military budget is used for, defence budget, as they call it euphemistically. And you can see this broken down on Wikipedia, so that you can be in no doubt as to where it's all gone. The $1 trillion that are poured into black budget programs, we simply don't know what it goes into. So this should be ended immediately, because obviously the amount of money that's being paid in tax it is, while it's less than in some European nations, is still astronomical, and it's still targeting people of modest means and asking them to contribute when bankers are being bailed out with trillions of dollars, when they're being told that austerity has to take place and you'll have to tighten your belts because of these budget deficits and because of the debt. And there's nothing we can do about it, just because of a credit crisis, and it's just because of the global financial systemic economic austerity that's taking place, and all these other various things. And we need to have quantitative easing all the time. We need to do this. We need to do that. Blah blah blah. And really, there are even within this existing economic paradigm, which I fundamentally disagree with, there are very simple, basic things that could be done to completely reorder society in a way that would benefit virtually everyone. It wouldn't benefit the small number of small percentage of people that control all these vested interests. It'd just benefit the general public. So that's all I have to say about foreign policy. Those are the 17 points that could be implemented immediately, pretty much. Obviously, some of them would take some time, such as closing down all the military bases, but I think you could reasonably estimate that the entire list could be achieved within a year. I'm going to be discussing in the second half of the programme economic policy, but I'll just briefly take a break here and just play a record, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, so the first economic point, which is point 18 in the list, is to renegotiate, or better still end completely, the North American Free Trade Agreement, often referred to as NAFTA, which was promised during the election campaign. So I'll just play a brief clip of Obama making various promises related to NAFTA during the 2008 election campaign.
This was the Canada moment at last night's Democratic debate.
Will you as president say we are out of NAFTA in 6 months?
I have said that I will renegotiate NAFTA, so obviously you'd have to say to Canada and Mexico that that's exactly what we're going to do.
And I think actually Senator Clinton's answer on this one is right.
But how much of that bluster is real? CTV News has learned that within the last month, a senior member of the Barack Obama campaign telephoned the Canadian ambassador to the United States, Michael Wilson. In that call, the Obama operative warned the ambassador that NAFTA would become part of the debate in the Democratic primaries and that Obama would take some heavy swings at the trade deal, but told the ambassador, "Don't worry, it's just campaign rhetoric. It's not serious." Canadian sources say that the message was taken as being completely authentic and representing the views of the Obama campaign. But last night in Ohio, where NAFTA is blamed for massive job losses, Obama promised the voters that he would do what his campaign privately told Canada he would not.
I think we should use the hammer of a potential opt-out as leverage to ensure that we actually get labor and environmental standards that are enforced.
Late tonight, a spokesman for the Obama campaign did not deny that the contact had been made. But
it goes to the question of truthfulness. In other words, did Barack Obama say one thing privately to a foreign government and then say something entirely different to the voters of Ohio and Texas? And it appears that tonight that's exactly what he did, and that's exactly what the Clinton campaign is zeroing in on.
Thanks, Tom.
Good night, Lloyd.
So what is asserted there at the end of the report, we in fact know for a fact was the case, because there is a particular memorandum that came to light, which is now referred to as the Demora Memorandum, that was acquired by the magazine Slate. This was called the Demora Memorandum because it was written by Joseph Demora, who was a Canadian diplomat. It recounted a meeting between Austin Goolsbee, who's a senior economic advisor to the Obama campaign at the time, and George Ryu, who was the Consul General for the Canadian government. They talk about the fact that Obama has absolutely no intention to reform NAFTA whatsoever. And then the final paragraph simply states, "As Obama continues to court the economic populist vote, particularly in upcoming contests like Ohio, we are likely to see a continuation of some of the messaging that hasn't played in Canada's favour. This should continue to be viewed in the context in which it is delivered, i.e. it's just electioneering, and he has absolutely no intention of carrying any of it out whatsoever." So, NAFTA, without getting deeply into all of the effects of NAFTA, it's been very, very bad for the American worker because it's another free trade agreement that it's crony capitalism, open borders, anti-protectionism, anti-trade and tariff, and anti-trades on tariff. Sorry, tariffs on trade. It's all the things I talked about in my first couple of programs that helped create this crony capitalist interdependent global system that's dominated by a few private banks, a few central private banks. And stuff like the NAFTA agreement ultimately benefits them because all economic activity is fed into these banks. And they just want to see a smaller number of people dominate the culture, society and economy as possible, because less diversity is obviously good for them. Point 19 is to properly audit the Federal Reserve and hold it accountable for its actions. Federal Reserve, obviously hugely vilified part of the United States infrastructure. Lots of books and videos and films been made about them. Creature from Jekyll Island is quite a famous one. The Money Masters goes into it in great depth as well. I'm just going to play a brief clip discussing the Federal Reserve. So I'll just go to this clip, and this discusses some of the issues related to the Federal Reserve, and also how the City of London feeds into this system.
And the whole Federal Reserve Bank itself is a vestige of the Bank of England. You know, Ben Franklin said that one of the primary reasons there was the Declaration of Independence was for the colonies to escape the Bank of England. The Bank of England and its central banking functionality and the way it oppressed the colonies through its fiat money system was one of the reasons why in the Constitution it says no money shall be traded except gold and silver. This is what the founders recognized would be a way to defeat the central bankers. And then in 1913, after several failed attempts, finally the Federal Reserve Bank was created in the U.S., which is really just an extension of the Bank of England and the European Central Bank and the Bank of International Settlements and the old world monarchs in Europe. As of 1913, America started to slip back into a monarchy, and now after the Bush years, you know, really the U.S. is under the thumb of an entrenched oligopoly or monarchy or aristocracy who's basically just taking all the wealth that they possibly can out of the system, and the population, of course, is left in a very, very bad position. And they're not really sure exactly what's going on. As I've said, they've been in a bit of a daze, but they are now finally waking up to this. So it'll be interesting to see how that energy vents.
So that was Max Keiser there talking about the Federal Reserve System, and there'll be more from Keiser later in the programme. Point 20 would be to begin a huge independent inquiry into precisely where the TARP bailout money went, which Ben Bernanke was completely unable to account for when asked about it. I really want to know what it was used for and explicitly ensure the public that public money would never be used again to bail out huge investment banks, with trillions and trillions of dollars having gone to these huge investment banks due to their quote-unquote financial difficulties. Although it's all just financial fraud. The system is just, it's not that fraud happens within the system, it's that fraud is the fundamental benefactor of the system, it's the fundamental characteristic that drives the system. I'm just going to play a brief clip though in which we hear Bernanke unable to account for these trillions of dollars.
Welcome, Mr. Chairman. We have spent a lot of time in Congress talking about the $700 billion TARP bailout, which I voted against as it happens. Not a whole lot has been talked about with regard to the $2.2 trillion that the Fed has lent out. Now, I find it absolutely extraordinary that I wrote you a letter and I said, hey, who'd you lend the money to? What were the terms of those loans? How can my constituents in Vermont get some of that money? Who makes the decisions? Do you guys sit around in a room? Do you make it? Are there conflicts of interest? So my question to you is, will you tell the American people to whom you lent $2.2 trillion of their dollars? Will you tell us who got that money and what the terms are of those agreements?
We explain each of our programs. In terms of the terms, we explain the terms exactly. We explain what the collateral requirements are. We explain what.
To whom did you explain that?
It's on our website.
Yeah. Okay.
So all that information is available in our commercial paper program.
And who got the money?
Hundreds and hundreds of banks. Any bank or that has access to the U.S. Federal Reserve's discount.
You tell us who they are.
No, because the reason that is counterproductive and will destroy the value of the program is that banks will not come to the discount.
Isn't that too bad?
Sorry?
In other words, isn't that too bad? They took the money, but they don't want to be public about the fact that they received it. We heard a whole lot about AIG. They're in the front pages.
These are very.
Now, I got banks and I have businesses in the state of Vermont who are in a lot of trouble. Not banks. Our banks, by the way, are doing pretty well. Now, how do these guys who are honest business people get it? Do you have to be a large, greedy, reckless financial institution to apply for these monies?
There is no subsidy. There is no capital involved. There is no gift involved. It is a collateralized, short-term liquid loan that is both over-collateralized and is recourse to the company itself. We have never lost a penny doing it.
And how can other institutions get those loans as well?
According to the law, we are supposed to be lending to depository institutions.
Let me just say this, Mr. Chairman. I have a hard time understanding how you have put $2.2 trillion at risk without making those names available, those institutions public. And we're going to introduce legislation today, by the way, to demand that you do that. It is unacceptable to me that that goes on.
Point 21 would be to end all high-frequency trading within the United States. Ideally, I'd like to close the financial markets down completely, but I'm not sure if this is a realistic short-term aim. But I'd at least like to ensure that trading is done by people, not machines. So most people don't know what high-frequency trading is, but all of the big investment banks, I think particularly Goldman Sachs has been heavily involved with this. But I think now all of the major investment banks in the United States, so Citigroup, JP Morgan, etc., as far as I know, all have these algorithmic supercomputers that make billions and billions of trades per day. That they're trading every nanosecond and every fraction of a nanosecond, and they're just constantly siphoning money out of the United States economy. So I'll just play a clip which explains this. Again, this is Max Keiser speaking about high-frequency trading, which it shouldn't really. High-frequency trading is a very euphemistic term. It should really be called computer trading or supercomputer trading, which is essentially what it is. High-frequency trading implies that it doesn't really include the electronic element of it, which is the critical respect. So I'll just briefly play this clip and then I'll discuss an incident related to high-frequency trading, which is of importance.
All you need to know about markets was written in an editorial in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago. It was called Lessons of the Brain-Damaged Investor. And in this editorial, they explain why people with slight brain damage do better as investors than people with normal brain functionality. Why? Because the slightly brain-damaged person has no empathy. And that's the key. If you don't have any empathy, you do well as an investor. And so Wall Street breeds people who have no empathy to go in there and to make decisions and make trades that they have no compunction about and no thought whatsoever as to what they're doing might affect their fellow human being. So they breed these robots, these people who have no souls. And since they don't even want to pay these people anymore, they're now breeding robots, real algorithmic traders. Goldman Sachs in the high-frequency trading scandal. They put a computer next to the exchange, the New York Stock Exchange. This computer, this co-located computer as they call it, it front runs all the trades on the exchange and it hits the exchange with volumes of orders in ways that scalp pennies and nickels away from the exchange. It's like they're siphoning money all day long. They went one quarter last year, 30 or 60 straight days without a single down day and made millions of dollars every single day. Is that because, well, that's statistically impossible?
So in that clip, Keiser is talking about the human beings that operate in Wall Street having no compunction. Of course, machines have absolutely no compunction because they have no idea what an abstraction is. They just follow what they're programmed to do. If they see a market opportunity, they just take it. They have no concept of the fact that what they're doing has consequences. So we saw an interesting example of this in May 2010, which is an incident that's known as the flash crash, or the crash of 245, or sometimes the 2010 flash crash. This was a United States stock market crash on the Thursday, the 6th of May 2010, in which the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is essentially like the FTSE index you may have heard of in Britain, it's just a series of companies, important industrial and corporate companies that represent the biggest within the United States, and the industrial average measures these companies essentially. So the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged about 1,000 points, about 10%. This was the second largest point swing, over 1,000 points, and the biggest one-day point decline on an intraday basis in the Dow Jones Industrial Average history. And this was caused by computers and by computer trading entirely. And there are a series of causal reasons for why it occurred, but the machine simply saw the opportunity to make money, so they just crashed the markets. and they don't have any concept that wasn't a very good idea. They just don't. It doesn't mean anything to them. But this is the consequence of having millions of machines processing. Well, I say millions of machines, machines with phenomenal processing power, collectively engaging in trillions of transactions. I mean, God knows how many they do during a year. You've heard these astronomical numbers, like the number of atoms in the universe and stuff. I mean, this must be. I mean, a quadrillion is 1,000 trillion. That would be a conservative. It must be far, far more than that. But I mean, they're performing a phenomenal number of transactions, and this is why now the overwhelming majority of stock market transactions that take place are actually conducted by machines. So in my view, this needs to end immediately and completely. So point 22 is to ban all corporate lobbyists from Washington. I wouldn't have any objection to banning all charitable lobbyists as well, because I'll go into the reasons why next week. I mean, I'd like to see the political system fundamentally changed. But as far as I'm concerned, politicians, senators, congressmen, and women are just representatives of the public. So, if they want to do something for charity, let them say that openly, and let the public vote for that. Don't let some lobbyists in there to try and twist their arm. Of course, corporate lobbyists completely outrank and outgun charitable lobbyists. So if we look at a list of the biggest lobbyists, it's pharmaceutical, health industry, insurance, electric utilities, business associations, computer and internet, oil and gas, manufacturing and distribution, hospitals, nursing homes. Of course, there's massive private healthcare in the United States. Virtually no, I mean, there's no equivalent of the NHS, so everyone has to have private healthcare. TV, movies and music, just the usual suspects that you would expect to see. And collectively, these companies have spent, and these lobbyists have spent tens of billions of dollars. This article's on a website called Open Secrets, and it's dealing with the years from 1998 to 2012. So the pharmaceutical industry alone has spent over $2.5 billion lobbying during that period. But if you put all the interest together, it's tens and tens of billions of dollars. So, just briefly going to play a clip here from the film Super Size Me. Probably quite a few people have heard of this film. It's where Morgan Spurlock ate McDonald's for 30 days, nothing but McDonald's, and discusses some of the issues related to McDonald's in the United States. I'm just going to play a clip from this program in which corporate lobbying is discussed, and we see some indication of the influence that corporate lobbying has on a critical issue of public health, which is, of course, food.
How much influence on government legislators does the food industry have?
Well, the food industry is an enormous business in the United States. Therefore, it employs very expensive and well-paid lobbyists. And those lobbyists are in Washington for two purposes. Number one, to make sure that no government agency ever says, eat less of the company's products. Number two, that the government never passes legislation that is unfavorable. And I guess the third one is to encourage the government to pass favorable legislation.
The GMA is one of those lobbies.
You're going to see us do what we do best, and that is market appropriately, finance education programs, as we're doing in a great abundance, getting good information out to parents so we can solve the problem. That's what we do in the food industry. We think that is a responsible, important role to play. We are not police, we are not regulators. We provide a safe, affordable abundance of food like the world has never seen.
The food industry and the broadcasters are extremely powerful lobbies, and they outgun us.
The industry has stepped up to the plate. We're going to do more. We want to do more. We recognize we have a role to play. We're part of the solution. We're part of the problem, and we also are part of the solution.
Did everyone hear what he just said? We're part of the problem. The lobbyists for Coke, Heinz, Smucker's, Kellogg's, Nestle, Kraft, Hershey, Sara Lee, Cadbury, General Mills, Seagram, Welch's, Wise, Anheuser-Busch, Birdseye, Lance, Campbell's, Carvel, Mars, Ocean Spray, Hormel, Dannon, and Pepsi said we're part of the problem. I think we're making some headway.
So you can see just from that brief clip the power and influence of an organisation like the Grocery Manufacturers Association. And since then, in fact, the Grocery Manufacturers Association merged with another huge lobbyist group to form an even bigger lobbyist that lobbies the government on food policy and so forth. So, I mean, that's just one area, of course. If you look at all the other areas in which I just mentioned, in which huge lobbyist groups constantly lobbying the government, constantly lobbying Congress, constantly lobbying the Senate, and trying to get people to as the woman described, pass legislation that's favourable for them and block legislation that's unfavourable for them. So this is extensively covered by the film Fooding, but you see the food industry strongly opposing anything that will hold them to account. So labelling of GM food, for example, they strongly oppose that because they simply don't want people to have that information. There's a bill in the United States called the Cheeseburger Bill, in which a raft of food companies managed to pressure the government into passing this bill that states it's now illegal for you to sue the fast food manufacturers or any food manufacturer for any reason. And these are such punitive measures, and the laws are so stringent that in the film Fooding, there's a woman whose son died from eating tainted meat, and she now doesn't feed her other kid any meat at all, I think, or she certainly won't feed him any meat from hamburger patties. But she is reluctant to say this on camera. She won't even say, "I don't feed my family meat anymore." She won't even say that because she's worried she'll get sued, and she knows the legislation is probably in the favour of the corporate sector, of the actual food production industry, not her. Even though she's just stating a fact, it's not even a personal opinion. She just said, "I don't." She won't even say, "I don't feed my family meat." She can't even say that because of this punitive measure. So these are some of the powers that these lobbying organisations have, and that they've managed to exert over the political process and ultimately the law of the land. So there was a case where Oprah Winfrey was dragged through the courts for years because she said, "I don't think we should be feeding people hamburgers," or words to that effect, on her television programme. She had a massive court case against meat producers. I think there were some Texan farmers involved, and it went on for years. So these are the extent, and obviously you could argue that food isn't even the most important area in which there are lobbyists in Washington every day trying to get things passed in the favour of the corporate sector and against generally the public's interest, considering there are arms manufacturers, oil and gas, which we know the foreign policy consequences of that are there every day trying to get favourable legislation passed. So point 23 relates to the elimination of the US budget deficit. This would be the case if we implemented all the economic measures that I've suggested. Once this has occurred, and once the budget deficit has been eliminated, and indeed there should be a budget surplus once the black budgets and so forth have been eradicated, then I would end the policy of quantitative easing immediately. So there's an article here in Futures Mag that just discusses QE3. This is the third raft of quantitative easing because under the present economic circumstances, it's necessary to keep printing money to service this debt, as I discussed previously. So you've got the article here headlined QE3 and beyond, $85 billion per month and counting. So you've got the United States essentially printing $85 billion of money every month just to try and bail itself out of this ridiculous economic situation. It can't possibly do that because until the budget deficit is not just reduced, as you hear Cameron talking about and Obama talking about, but eliminated completely, they're just going to have to borrow more and more money. It's only because, I'm putting in these simplistic terms, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But in essence, the reason they're still having to borrow is because they have this huge debt, this $1 trillion of debt, this $16 trillion of admitted government debt, although there are many, many, many trillions of dollars of liabilities that they also can't meet. And then in addition to that, they're hemorrhaging money on top of that because they're not even breaking even. The only thing that allows them to do this, I mentioned previously, is the fact they've got a favourable credit rating. They wouldn't have a favourable credit rating if it wasn't for the fact that the credit rating agencies benefit because they're owned by the same people that own the banks from them having a favourable credit rating. If it was beneficial for the United States to be downgraded to junk status tomorrow, which would mean that they can't produce credit and they can't borrow money at the same favourable rates they do at present. They'd be finished. I mean, they're just broke, full stop. So this quantitative easing policy is not going to result in any restoration of American prosperity or any sort of recovery, as is constantly implied. In fact, it's not even creating economic growth. Not that the piddling amount of economic growth that's being created is enough to even create a small down payment of any significance against the amount of debt that's outstanding, but it's not even creating economic growth because, as I've played, that was stated in a clip that Max Keiser gave when he gave an interview to RT some time ago. He described it as debt saturation. It's the point we've reached the point of debt saturation where adding more and more debt to the existing economic system in order to create growth simply can't create any reasonable down payments against the existing debt. So you just reach the point where currency is inevitably going to be devalued by this. However, if we cut the budget deficit in the way, if the United States cut the budget deficit in the way that I've described, which is easily achievable, then you would then have a budget surplus. Once you had a budget surplus, you can end the policy of quantitative easing immediately, which is devaluing the dollar and making everyday people, just people of modest means, people that are on food stamps, which is now getting close to 50 trillion, it's 47 trillion that are reliable on government handouts just to eat. And of course there are tens of trillion, 47 billion I should say. And of course there are tens of billions of Americans on top of that are also very, very poor indeed. So point 24 is that any surplus budget, which would easily be created by what I've described previously, should be diverted into 1, paying off some of the existing debt, 2, boosting America's gold reserves, 3, subsidising local small-scale farmers and ideally creating some new ones, and 4, funding social, educational and training programmes for the poorest people in society. I personally would start with the 47 million people I just mentioned who are on food stamps. I'd be looking to end the food stamp programme completely and have people do something productive for which they would receive a government paycheck. This is all perfectly achievable. I don't know why I just said there's 47 billion people on food stamps because the population of America is less than 300 million. But there's 47 million people on food stamps, soon to be 50 billion, I should say. So if you look at this article from October 2012, it's headlined 1 million more Americans sign up for food stamps in only a year. The number of Americans going to the government for assistance has once again hit a new high. More than 46 million Americans are now enrolled in the federal welfare food stamp system, more than double the amount from only a decade earlier. So that amount has doubled within 10 years. It's now over 47 million. And I say this is absolutely dirt poor people. This is virtually on the streets because they've got no money and no way of feeding themselves. They're just reliant on a pittance of a government handout just to be able to get food. That's the only thing that's stopping them, and in many cases their children, from starving to death. And this is all a product of don't let people say it's because they're not tried hard enough, or they haven't worked hard enough, or they're lazy, or they're scroungers, or any of these things. It's purely a product of this fascistic economic system that could be changed. It could be changed in the ways that I'm describing here today. So if you were to implement these changes and then create this surplus budget and then pour it into the schemes I've suggested, then you begin to change some of these factors that completely distort the economy. You've still got massive corporations, you've still got massive banks that will try to exert an influence over the society, but it's a start in reordering the social order towards one that actually helps poor people and gives them purpose and gives them something to do that is productive. This can all be achieved. The only reason it isn't achieved is because that's not profitable for corporations. It's not profitable for the banking sector. This is the only reason that we see the present economic order, which could be amended, it could be challenged. But at present it hasn't been challenged because these vested interests have taken over the government to such a great extent that and have taken over the processes that take place within society to such a great extent that it would take a huge coordinated effort from the people in order to change these things, and no such coordinated effort has been forthcoming. At the moment we can't really expect a political solution to these problems because unfortunately in the United States 98% of people still turn up and vote for Obama and Romney, the two corporate candidates who will do everything they possibly can to not merely not address this agenda, not merely not address this status quo, but do what they can to actually advance it and make it even more cemented. Point 25 is to end the Security and Prosperity Partnership and guarantee that there will be no further agreements of this nature. So just briefly to read from Wikipedia about the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America. This was a region-level dialogue with the stated purpose of providing greater cooperation on security and economic issues. The partnership was founded in Waco, Texas on March 23, 2005 by Paul Martin, Prime Minister of Canada, Vicente Fox, President of Mexico, and George W. Bush, President of the United States. It was the second of such regional-level agreements involving the United States of America, following the 1997 Partnership for Prosperity and Security in the Caribbean. Now, this is no longer active because it was dissolved, but there have been similar partnerships that have been brought up since then. And one of the most important is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So I'll just play a clip about this which discusses this agreement. It's very much an extension of the kind of themes that discussed previously in agreements like NAFTA.
Welcome to tonight's Fireside Fridays with your host, Alona Minkowski.
Well, it's Friday, and unfortunately this week, like most weeks, we have another broken campaign promise to reflect on. You remember that thing that Obama said about transparency, right? That his administration would be the most open and transparent administration ever. Well, we've covered one example after another that's proven that to be far from the truth. And this week, the administration is at least being called out on it by Senator Ron Wyden. He's one of the few Democratic lawmakers out there that actually speaks up, that takes a stand for your privacy, your civil liberties, that seems to understand the dangers of a growing and secretive surveillance state. Now, he's exposed elements of the Patriot Act that were being abused. He took a stand against SOPA and PIPA, and he's blasted CISPA. And now this week, he's decided to take on a new battle. You see, Senator Wyden is also the chair of the Senate Finance Subcommittee on International Trade, Customs, and Global Competitiveness. Yeah, it's a long title, but it would make sense that somebody with that title would have access to details surrounding trade agreements that our government is making, right? Well, it turns out that the Obama administration isn't granting that access. Now, all this surrounds the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's an international trade agreement between 9 nations about which we know very little. We're going to get into more details next week, but for now, what information has been put out there shows that this agreement would ban Buy American preferences for U.S. manufacturers, and that it would create new intellectual property standards that would increase prescription drug prices abroad. Now, just those two things alone are a big deal. They would affect prices here in America, businesses, people. And yet the administration isn't being transparent about the negotiating process or the details with members of Congress that should be reviewing international trade agreements. Now, Senator Wyden says that even after his staff got all the appropriate clearance, they're still being barred from viewing the details of the proposals. But guess who isn't being barred by the administration? According to Senator Wyden, and these are his own words from this week, he says that, quote, the majority of Congress is being kept in the dark as to the substance of the TPP negotiations, while representatives of U.S. corporations like Halliburton, Chevron, PHRMA, Comcast, and the Motion Picture Association of America are being consulted and made privy to the details of the agreement. Isn't that nice? The corporations are being let in on the deal, but lawmakers aren't. Now, I guess that we could call this a trend for this administration because it sounds pretty similar to the way that they treated ACTA, the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement. Now, there's a lot of anger about this on the Hill already. On May 3rd, more than 60 House Democrats and 1 House Republican sent a letter to Obama objecting the Buy American ban. Then on May 15th, Congressman Darrell Issa leaked the entire draft of the intellectual property chapter from this deal onto his website to make a point about the need for more transparency. And now this week, Ron Wyden introduced legislation clarifying that the U.S. Trade Representative must consult with lawmakers during trade talks. Now, the idea that you would even have to introduce legislation for something like that, to clarify something like that, it's ludicrous. But like I said, it's just yet another example of the promised most transparent administration ever spitting on transparency and cherishing the veil of secrecy.
Point 26 would be to investigate the huge manipulation of markets in the United States. particularly with relation to derivatives and precious metals. Again, this would need to be an independent investigation, of course, independent of the kind of crony capitalist and former banking people that have become fundamentally involved in government at the highest levels. So to deal with the latter of these two issues first, there's an article here from the Daily Telegraph dated the 11th of July 2012, which I'm not going to go into in great detail, but just headline, "The price of gold has been manipulated. This is more scandalous than LIBOR." LIBOR, of course, being the rigging of the LIBOR rates, which was essentially hundreds of billions of dollars being stolen by the banking sector. I think HSBC were intimately involved. There's another article here on the GATA.org website, the Gold Antitrust Action Committee, that's just entitled "BBC's Panorama Killed Report Exposing Silver Market Manipulation." This was discussed on the Keiser report. There's a brief discussion of this in this article. And the episode of the Keiser report, if you want to watch it, is episode 375. So you can see a guy called Naylor Leyland, who's the investment director of Cheviot Asset Management in London, who discusses this killing of the Panorama program that was going to expose some of the market manipulation that was taking place in the United States and in Britain as well. And then we saw in August 2012 the US probe into the bank manipulation of silver markets was dropped. So that was never investigated, whereas it should have been. I mentioned derivatives previously. This is just essentially a financial investment instrument, but there's a derivatives bubble that's worth that amounts to conservatively hundreds of trillions of dollars, and realistically, it's probably as much as $1.5 quadrillion, which is equal to $1,500 trillion, if you can imagine that. But it's far, far, far more than the gross domestic product of the entire planet, many, many times over. So we'll just play a quick clip which just discusses this briefly, but the important thing to note really is that derivatives are just essentially the trading of debt. It's just an instrument of trading debt. Again, this is from the Zeitgeist Coming Forward film and features Max Keiser again.
The trading of fraudulent claims back and forth between banks to generate fees, to generate bonuses, has become the GDP producing growth engine of the United States economy. Even though they're essentially trading fraudulent claims that there's absolutely no hope of ever paying back. They're processing and generating and re-securitizing nothing. If I write $20 billion on a cocktail napkin and I sell it to JP Morgan, while JP Morgan writes $20 billion on a cocktail napkin, and we swap those two cocktail napkins at a bar, and we each pay ourselves 1/4% in a fee, we make a lot of money for our Christmas bonus. We each have on our books a $20 billion cocktail napkin, which has no real value until such time as the system is no longer able to absorb bogus cocktail napkins, in which case we go to the government to get bailed out.
And because of Wall Street and the global stock market, there are now conservatively about $700 trillion of outstanding fraudulent claims known as derivatives, still waiting to collapse, a value amounting to over 10 times the gross domestic product of the entire planet. And while we have seen the bailouts of corporations and banks by governments, which of course comedically borrow their money from banks to begin with, we are now seeing attempts to bail out whole countries by conglomerates of other countries through the international banks. But how do you bail out a planet? There is no country out there that isn't now saturated in debt. The cascade of sovereign debt defaults we have seen can only be the beginning when the math is taken into account. It has been estimated in the United States alone that income tax would need to be raised to 65% per person just to cover the interest in the near future. Economists are now foreshadowing that within a few decades, 60% of the countries on the planet will be bankrupt.
Point 27 would be to actually ensure that some of the banksters who commit this massive fraud, so the LIBOR rigging scandal and all the other things that we discussed that are completely distorting the marketplace and that are putting people, literally billions of people across the globe, in incredibly vulnerable economic circumstances. Discussed previously that the level of the poverty that happens on a global basis. But I mean, within the United States, we see people now, as I say, the number of people on food stamps that has doubled in a decade. This isn't a coincidence. It's happening purely because of this banking fascism, this crony capitalism that's taking place. So to ensure that these banksters are tried in courts of law as criminals, not made to pay a piss in a pot fine for what they've done without any other recriminations whatsoever, and then allowed to continue with what they were doing before. This would be nothing new, because thousands of bankers were jailed during the savings and loans crisis during the 1980s and 1990s. So there's an article here in the Huffington Post just describing and discussing the number of bankers that were jailed during the savings and loan crisis, with the article just being headlined, "Where are the handcuffs now? During the savings and loan crisis, thousands of banksters went to jail." This is dated 25th of May 2011. It's also this was also discussed in the Financial Times, so it's not some narrow concept that isn't being discussed by mainstream financial media. Bankers have been jailed in the past for fraud. There's no reason they can't be jailed in the present for fraud, but somehow they've managed to take over this society to such an extent that they can't be held to account even slightly. Even when they're engaging in massive criminal activity, there's still nothing is being done to hold them to account. The LIBOR rigging scandal has just been swept under the carpet with no real recriminations, with no real punitive measures, with no real penalties for people who are involved. Certainly none of their liberty has been taken away. And of course, such activity can still take place because all these derivatives markets, all this high frequency trading, all the stuff that I've been discussing previously, it's all happening every day. It'll all be happening tomorrow as soon as the markets open up. And it's all happening now in the markets that are currently open. So there have to be some measures against this, just to say to people, look, if you commit massive fraud, there is a consequence. And the consequence is you go to jail. You go to jail like a criminal. Because you're a massive criminal. You're a bigger criminal than someone that just breaks into a house and steals someone's telly, I mean, it's quite right that should be treated as a criminal offence. So if that's going to be treated as a criminal offence, surely stealing hundreds of billions of dollars and just siphoning money out of the economy on a massive scale should be treated as a criminal offence as well. The last economic measure and the last issue that I'm going to be discussing today briefly is point number 28, which would be to ban within the borders of the United States all forms of carbon trading, carbon offsetting, trading in food and water derivatives, essentially all economic activity that simply serves the purpose of making a killing for the financial sector while inflating the price of staple goods for people of modest means. So there's a couple of articles here. Just want to briefly go into one that's printed in Business Insider. And the article is headlined Cities, and that's cities as in Citibanks, one of the big four American investment banks. Citi's top economist says the water market will soon eclipse oil. Citi economist Willem Buiter tells clients to invest in the water industry, which will soon become hotter than oil. I expect to see in the near future a massive expansion of investment in the water sector, including the production of fresh, clean water from other sources, storage, shipping and transportation of water, and I expect to see pipeline networks that will exceed the capacity for those for oil and gas today. I see fleets of water tankers and storage facilities that dwarf those we currently have for oil, natural gas and LNG. I see new canal systems dug for water transportation, similar in ambition and scale to those currently in progress in China, linking the Yangtze River in the south to the Yellow River in the arid north. I expect to see a globally integrated market for fresh water within 25 to 30 years. Once the spot markets for water are integrated, futures markets and other derivative water-based financial instruments, puts, calls and swaps, both exchange-traded and OTC, will follow. There will be different grades and types of fresh water, just the way we have light, sweet and heavy sour crude oil today. Water as an asset class will, in my view, become eventually the single most important physical commodity-based asset class, dwarfing oil, copper, agricultural commodities and precious metals. So there's some technical stuff there which I'm not going to go into, but needless to say, derivative trading always results in the price for a domestic market of a particular commodity going up, and the people that control that particular commodity making billions and billions of dollars out of it, which is why derivatives are so popular. So this is a particularly sick scheme to trade water derivatives. So the most fundamental human need is going to be traded so that the financial sector can make a massive killing out of it while it's literally killing other people and making them unable to afford water, to be unable to get access to water due to its obtrusive price that has been placed on it by financial sector transactions and by trading mechanisms. Completely unnecessary, doesn't benefit anyone in the slightest. There's absolutely no need to have a financial market related to water. Doesn't benefit me, doesn't benefit you, doesn't benefit poor people that live in poor sanitary conditions. It's simply going to make it less likely they have access to clean water. It just benefits the banking sector and the people that control this market. So it's an absolutely disgusting plan that we're probably going to see it come to fruition unless there's a very big social change and a very big change in our thinking. We're probably going to see water derivatives. We're probably going to see people dying of dehydration due to the financial sector trading. They're already making trillions. They're already making billions and billions of dollars by trading absolutely every possible human need and every possible thing they can think of. If they thought of squeezing $1 out of something, if there's a possible way of doing it, you can pretty much guarantee they've already come up with one. But this is a new one, squeezing an extra $1 out of water. So to deal with carbon trading, this is very heavily being promoted now. Already a massive carbon market in place, all completely unnecessary. It's all to do with the complete bullshit related to climate change that I'll be discussing in programmes in the future. But I'm not going to go into all the details because that'll be part of that programme. But I'll just briefly read the headline here in The Guardian. November 2009, carbon trading could be worth twice that of oil in the next decade. Market could be worth $3 trillion a year. And The Guardian are actually against this. The Guardian say here, enthusiasm to place it at the heart of Copenhagen is matched by growing criticism of the concept. Well, there should be criticism of the concept, you know. It's an absolutely diabolical concept that's going to result in people... It's a creation of a neo-feudal system. So I'll be discussing this in programmes in the future, but the emissions trading scheme market may see $3 trillion worth of transactions a year in the next decade or two, according to Andrew Ager, head of emissions trading at BAT Commodities in London, with it even being used as a hedge against falling equities or rising inflation. So it's just another way for the financial sector and these investment banks and trading community, you could describe it as, to make another killing. So whenever we hear these things being enthusiastically promoted, it's always by people from this community. So it's from a head of emissions trading here, enthusiastically telling us that about this $3 trillion market. So this is another total disaster for people of modest means, but it's something that the financial sector, the banking sector and the corporate sector are all pushing for very strongly. And as I say, I'll be discussing this in a programme in the future. So that's 28 measures that could be implemented to address certain foreign policy issues and certain economic issues. Most of these could be implemented immediately. Some of the more complex foreign policy related issues I will concede would take a while to implement. It would probably take a while to withdraw all American troops from foreign conflicts. It would take a while to shut down all overseas US military bases, but I believe this programme could be achieved within a year, by the time of the next budget roughly, because it would take a year to implement. By which time you'd have a situation, if it was all implemented, that America would have a budget surplus, and they'd be now investing money, they'd be moving it away from the arms industry, moving it away from all these interests that cause suffering and murder and distress all over the world, and into social programmes for the people that have been greatly suffering within the borders of the United States. You'd have a fundamentally more healthy social order. And while there'd still be huge problems and huge issues with the corporate sector and with money itself, with the way that it's created, with the power that the financial sector have, and the power of what I call the Bank for International Settlement system, which I discussed in my first programme, you know, this system is going to take some very strong opposition from a lot of people over a concerted period of time if it's going to be ever eradicated and if there's ever going to be a serious alternative to it. I don't expect to see it happening in my lifetime, and my primary reason for doing these programmes is just to make some tiny contribution to future generations actually hopefully seeing how insane the culture we live in today is, and hopefully doing something about it, hopefully coming together to say, look, no more, this is going to go on. There's been too much suffering, There's too many people that can't get food. There's too many people that can't get water. There's too many people that have been bombed to death. That they've been killed by completely needless military action. There's too many military bases. There's too much suffering. It needs to end today. And the acceptability for a very small raft of people that are, many of them are dollar trillionaires. Many of them are so wealthy and have control of certain resources that money is completely meaningless to them. And then, of course, there's a raft of billionaires just beneath this sort of peak of the pyramid. It's just simply not acceptable for these people to continue running roughshod over everyone else and continuing to drive public policy and continue to drive foreign policy to the extent that the needs and wishes and basic humanity even of the general public is just completely decimated, just so these incredibly greedy people who already are wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice can have a bit more. It was aptly summed up by George Carlin, where he simply stated, "We already know what these people want. They want more for themselves and less for everyone else." And that's what the political culture is constantly pushing towards and constantly attempting to achieve. More for these people and less for everyone else. And we see a situation now where the amount of wealth in society, in the world as a whole, but it will also vary from country to country, is now very explicitly in the hands of a tiny, small number of people. And that's just the wealth. That's before you go into resources, which are now dominated by an incredibly small number of people. And we see this process constantly being cemented now by foreign policy action all over the world and by the kind of domestic policies that are being put forward as well. So this could be reversed tomorrow. This could be reversed by the measures that I've put in place. And people will say, oh, but the Congress and the Senate would block it. I'll be dealing with this argument next week. But, I mean, there are very obvious arguments against that. So that's all I have to say for this week, and I'll be continuing this discussion next week. So just remind you once again to visit the website flippingthepyramid.co.uk, where you can listen to this programme again and also view a great deal of other useful information. And my YouTube channel is Breakdown Radio Show, where you can listen to this programme again, listen to my previous programmes, and there's also a huge number, over 100 playlists of other useful information that relates to the themes that are discussed in these programmes and that I will be discussing in the future. But that's all I have to say for today, so thank you very much for taking the time to listen, and I'll speak to you all next week.